The fire had been out for 6 hours. No ember, no coals, nothing but a cold hearth and the sound of wind pressing hard against the log walls. Outside, the thermometer, a crude tin gauge nailed to a fence post, read somewhere below 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that turns breath to smoke the moment it leaves your lips. And yet, inside that cabin, it was warm. Not the desperate warmth of a fire burning itself thin in the middle of the night. Not the artificial warmth of blankets pulled chin-high over shivering bodies. Real warmth. Radiating, steady, bone-deep warmth. Rising silently from the floor itself. A neighbor who stopped by that morning described it years later, according to local oral accounts. I expected to find her frozen. Instead, I found her making coffee. No one in the valley understood it. The cabin was small, roughly 16 by 18 feet, built without any of the heavy masonry the German settlers up the ridge were known for. No Russian-style oven, no double-wall fireplace. From the outside, it looked ordinary, humble even. A single chimney, a low-pitched roof, gaps in the chinking that should have let the cold straight through. But something in how that cabin was built was different. Something no one had noticed. Something hidden, quite literally, beneath their feet. That winter, by most local accounts, the brutal stretch between 1871 and 1872 in the highlands of Western Virginia would prove to be one of the harshest in a generation. Temperatures dropped to single digits for weeks. Firewood ran short. Families burned fence rails, furniture, anything that would catch. And still, every morning, that cabin held its warmth. The woman who built it wasn't an engineer. She hadn't studied thermodynamics or read the works of any European scientist. She was a homesteader, working alone, with river stones, river clay, and the particular kind of intelligence that only comes from paying close attention to the world around you. What she understood, and what the rest of the valley would take an entire winter to figure out, is the subject of this story. If you've ever wanted to know what real heat retention looks like, stay with this. Because what she put under that floor changed everything. Her name, as best as local land records and church ledgers from Pendleton County can reconstruct, was Nora Calloway. She had arrived in the South Branch Valley sometime around 1868, traveling west from the Shenandoah with a wagon, 2 draft horses, and a reputation for doing things her own way. She was somewhere in her mid-30s. Widowed, by most accounts, though the details of her earlier life remain unclear. What the records do show is this. She filed a homestead claim on 40 acres of thin-soiled bottomland in the fall of that same year, and she began building before the first frost. The valley she chose was not the easiest ground. It sat between 2 ridges that funneled northern winds down the hollow like a chimney run in reverse. Cold air pouring in from above, pooling in the low spots, staying long after the sun had climbed the slopes and warmed the higher farms. The neighbors who had been there longer knew the bottomland. They had watched other settlers try it. Most of them eventually moved up the hill, or gave up entirely and headed back east. Nora did not move up the hill. She had arrived with a clear eye and a methodical habit of observation that those who knew her described, according to oral accounts collected in the county decades later, as almost unsettling. She would stand in the field at different times of day, morning, midday, late afternoon, and simply watch. Watch where the shadows fell. Watch where the ground stayed wet longest after rain. Watch where the frost was still white at noon when everywhere else it had melted. She was learning the land before she asked anything of it. By the time she broke ground for the cabin's foundation, she had spent the better part of 2 months simply walking the property. She had identified a slight rise, no more than 3 feet above the surrounding bottomland, where the cold air pooled less severely. She oriented her building site with the long wall facing south and a single door positioned away from the prevailing wind. These decisions alone put her ahead of most cabins built in haste by settlers who simply picked a flat spot and started notching logs. But it was what she did next that set her apart. Before she laid a single log, before she mixed a single batch of daubing or cut a single rafter, she spent 3 full days at the river. The south branch of the Potomac ran cold and clear at the valley's edge, its bed loaded with smooth, rounded stones, granite and quartzite, worn to dense ovals and oblongs by centuries of current. She did not collect the flat stones most settlers grabbed for hearth bases or stepping stones. She selected specific pieces, dense, heavy, roughly the size of a man's fist or slightly larger. Stones with no visible cracks or seams. Neighbors who watched her load the wagon asked what she was building. A proper fireplace, they assumed. A big one. The kind of heavy masonry base that the German families up the ridge were known for. She told them she was building a floor. They nodded politely and said nothing. But the looks they exchanged said everything. The bottomland, they figured, had already gotten to her. A floor made of river stones, round, uneven, impossible to walk on comfortably, made no practical sense. You couldn't plane them flat. You couldn't nail boards to them. You couldn't sweep a round stone floor clean without spending half your morning doing it. What they did not yet understand was that Nora Calloway was not building a floor to walk on. She was building a machine. By October of 1871, the signs were already there for anyone who knew how to read them. The woolly bear caterpillars that crossed the farm roads in late September were darker than usual, nearly solid black from end to end, with only a thin rust-colored band at the middle. The old-timers in the valley had used this rough-and-ready forecast for generations, and that year, every caterpillar they found told the same story. The hickory trees dropped their nuts early. The wild geese pushed south a full 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The creek, by mid-October, already had ice forming in the slower bends at night, thawing reluctantly by noon. The winter of 1871 to 72 was announcing itself. Up the ridge, the German-speaking families who had settled the better-drained slopes during the 1840s and 1850s began their preparations with the disciplined efficiency of people who had lived through hard winters before and intended to survive this one the same way. They split and stacked firewood in quantities that would have seemed excessive to a newcomer. 4 cords, 5 cords, some of the larger households laying in as many as 7 cords of split oak and hickory. They rechinked their walls with fresh clay and straw. They reinforced their root cellars. They drove their livestock into covered pens weeks before the first serious snow. The preparations on the bottomland were different. Nora had a single cord of split wood stacked against the north wall of the cabin. 1 cord, less than a quarter of what the families up the ridge were putting by. Her neighbors noticed. One of them, a farmer named Elias Drummond who worked the adjacent 40 acres, rode over in early November, ostensibly to check on a fence line they shared, but in truth, according to his descendants' later accounts, to ask about the wood. He found her at the river again, loading more stones into the wagon bed. The cabin behind her already had its walls up, its roof sealed with split shingles, and the chimney mortared. It looked from the outside nearly finished, but Elias could see through the open doorway that there was still no floor inside, just a wide, flat bed of packed river sand, and beside it, stacked along both interior walls, hundreds of the dense rounded stones she had spent the better part of the autumn collecting. He asked about the wood. She told him she had what she needed. He looked at the single cord, looked at the stones, and made the calculation that any experienced farmer in that valley would have made. 1 cord of firewood, burned through an open-throat hearth at the rate most cabins burned it in a cold snap, roughly a half cord per week in the worst of January, would last her 2 weeks. Maybe 3, if she was careful and the cold stayed moderate. Elias Drummond was not a cruel man. He was practical. He offered to sell her another 2 cords at fair price, split and delivered. She thanked him, told him she appreciated the offer, and declined. He rode back up the ridge that evening genuinely uncertain whether she was uncommonly confident or simply not yet aware of how cold the bottom of that hollow could get. Within a week, 3 more neighbors had made similar rides down to the bottomland cabin. Each one left with some version of the same concern. Each one found her working steadily, not gathering more wood, but laying stones, row by careful row, across the floor of the cabin's main room, setting them into the river's sand in a deliberate pattern that no one who looked through the doorway could quite make sense of. One woman from the Methodist congregation who had welcomed Nora to the valley the previous year stopped by with a jar of preserved beans and a quiet warning. The winters here, she explained, were not like the winters in the Shenandoah. The cold came down the ridges at night, and sat in the hollow like standing water. It pressed through walls. It crept under doors. People had died, she said, in cabins that looked solid from the outside. Nora thanked her for the beans and the kindness. Then she went back to laying stones. No one yet understood what she was assembling. But the winter was coming regardless, indifferent to understanding, indifferent to doubt, and in a matter of weeks, it would test every decision she had made. The selection process was the part no one talked about later, because it was the part no one had watched closely enough to understand. When neighbors saw Nora at the riverbank, they saw a woman loading rocks into a wagon. That was the full picture, as far as they were concerned. Rocks from the river, hauled to the cabin, laid on the floor. Strange, yes. Pointless, probably. But harmless, certainly. What they missed, what only becomes clear when you understand the physics of what she was attempting, was that she was not simply collecting stones. She was sorting them. The South Branch riverbed at that stretch of the valley contained at least 4 distinct stone types, all rounded by centuries of current, but fundamentally different in composition. There was the pale, buff-colored limestone, common and easy to find, smooth and relatively light. There was a darker, coarser sandstone, heavy and porous, that turned dark at the edges when wet. There was the white quartzite, almost glassy in the sunlight, dense and hard, ringing with a faint metallic note when you knocked 2 pieces together. And there was the dull gray granite, irregular in shape, the heaviest of the 4, cold to the touch even on a warm day. Nora took almost none of the limestone. She left most of the sandstone. She took every piece of quartzite and dense granite she could load. This distinction, invisible to anyone watching from the bank, was the first technical decision that separated her floor from a pile of decorative rocks. Limestone, while plentiful and easy to work, has a relatively modest heat capacity. It absorbs warmth, but not deeply, and it releases it quickly. Porous sandstone is worse. The air pockets in its structure make it a poor thermal mass and a mediocre radiator. Quartzite and dense granite, by contrast, carry a significantly higher specific heat capacity, meaning they absorb more thermal energy per pound before their temperature rises, and they release that stored energy far more slowly once the heat source is removed. Oral accounts from families who later replicated her method, collected in the county well into the 20th century, noted consistently that she was particular about the stones in a way that seemed obsessive at the time. She would pick up a stone, hold it, sometimes knock it against another, and set it aside. She turned away stones that looked identical to the one she accepted. She passed over larger pieces in favor of smaller ones of the right type. She filled the wagon deliberately, taking her time, making choices that a casual observer would have read as random. They were not random. The size mattered as much as the type. Stones between 4 and 8 inches in their longest dimension, roughly the size of a large fist to a small canteen, gave her the best balance of surface area and mass. Smaller stones would heat quickly, but discharge too fast. Larger ones would take too long to fully absorb the heat from a fire burning only a few hours each evening. The mid-range stones she selected would, under the right conditions, absorb heat steadily over 4 to 6 hours of fire and release it slowly over 8 to 12 hours afterward. She hauled stones from that riverbank for the better part of 3 weeks. By the time she was done, her count, as best as local records can reconstruct from the accounts of 2 neighbors who helped her carry the final loads inside, was somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 individual stones. At an average weight of roughly 4 to 5 pounds each, the floor she was building would hold somewhere between 7,000 and 11,000 pounds of dense river rock beneath the surface of the main room alone. Nearly 5 tons of carefully selected thermal mass, laid into the ground of a 16 by 18-foot cabin. The neighbors finished helping her carry the last load inside, dusted their hands on their trousers, and rode home, shaking their heads. The stones, they agreed, were an eccentric woman's peculiarity. Come December, they figured she would understand why everyone else used wood floors. They were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. The laying of the stones took 11 days. Not because the labor was beyond one person, Nora worked steadily, methodically, without apparent hurry, but because the process demanded a precision that most observers, glancing through the doorway, completely failed to register. They saw a woman pressing rocks into dirt. What was actually happening was something closer to the careful assembly of a heat engine, one layer at a time, from the ground up. She began with excavation. Using a broad-bladed spade, she dug out the main room's floor to a depth of roughly 14 inches, a full foot and 2 inches below the original ground level. This was the decision that would later matter most, and it was the one nobody outside the cabin could see at all. The depth was not arbitrary. At 14 inches below the frost line in that part of the South Branch Valley, the soil temperature remained relatively stable through the winter, somewhere between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. That stable ground temperature would act as a thermal buffer, slowing the rate at which the stones shed their stored heat downward into the earth. She lined the excavated pit with a 2-inch layer of dry river sand, raked flat with a plank. Sand, unlike packed clay, allows for minor thermal expansion without cracking. It also provides a level, consistent bed that holds individual stones in tight contact with one another, contact that matters enormously when you're trying to conduct heat laterally across a surface. Then she began laying stones. The first course, the bottom layer, was her largest pieces. Dense, roughly oblong granite and quartzite specimens, each between 6 and 8 inches in their longest dimension, set tightly together with their flattest face down into the sand. She packed river clay into the gaps between them, pressing it firm with her fingers, leaving no hollow spaces. Hollow spaces trap air. Air is an insulator. Every air pocket in a thermal mass floor is a pocket where heat accumulates and then escapes upward instead of being stored and released slowly. She permitted none of them. The second course reversed the orientation. Where the first layer ran stones lengthwise east to west, the second ran them north to south, an overlapping bond, the same logic a mason uses when laying brick, ensuring that no single vertical seam ran continuously from bottom to top. Vertical seams are thermal weak points. Heat finds them and races upward. By alternating the orientation of each course, Nora forced heat to travel a longer, more tortuous path through the mass, slowing its release, extending the discharge curve across more hours. She laid 3 full courses of stone, then a final topping layer, smaller pieces, fist-sized, packed into the remaining gaps with clay, and then the whole surface covered with a half-inch skim of river clay mixed with a small amount of ash. The ash served 2 purposes. It added a fine particulate that helped the clay dry smooth and crack-resistant, and it darkened the surface. A dark surface absorbs radiant heat more efficiently than a pale one, a principle that required no textbook to discover if you had spent years watching dark soil warm faster than light soil in the spring sun. The finished floor sat approximately 2 inches above the original ground level, slightly raised, slightly domed at the center for drainage if water ever got in. It was not soft underfoot, but it was smoother than most people expected. Walking on it in leather-soled shoes felt like walking on a firmly packed road surface. Not comfortable in a way of pine boards, but solid. Permanent. Dense in a way that made the cabin feel anchored to the earth rather than perched above it. Total depth of the thermal mass assembly, from the base of the sand bed to the finished clay surface, approximately 16 inches. Total weight of stone in the main room, floor alone. Later estimates, based on accounts from neighbors who helped carry the material and observations recorded when the cabin was partially dismantled in the early 20th century, suggest somewhere between 8,500 and 10,000 pounds. When the last seam was clayed and smoothed, Nora built a small fire in the hearth. Not a large one, just enough to begin the first slow curing of the clay surface, and stood in the middle of her finished floor and pressed her boots sole flat against it. It was still cold. It would stay cold until it had been through several full fire cycles. But the machine was assembled. All it needed now was heat and time and a winter willing to test it. The winter, as it turned out, was more than willing. To understand what Nora Calloway built, it helps to understand what heat actually does when it moves through solid material, because the way most people think about fire and warmth is fundamentally incomplete, and that incomplete understanding is exactly why her neighbors were burning twice the wood and staying half as warm. When you light a fire in a standard frontier hearth, an open-throat fireplace, stone-backed, with a wide flue drawing hard, the majority of the heat generated by combustion goes straight up the chimney. Estimates from historical studies of open hearth efficiency suggest that as much as 80 to 90% of the thermal energy in a typical frontier fireplace was lost through the flue in convective updraft. The room received the remaining fraction, some radiant heat from the firebox face, some warm air pushed forward by the draft. But the fundamental design of an open hearth is, from a thermodynamic standpoint, nearly as wasteful as burning the wood outside. The heat that does enter the room from an open hearth is also predominantly convective. It heats the air, not the structure. And warm air, being less dense than cold air, rises immediately to the ceiling, stratifying the room so that the top 3 feet are significantly warmer than the floor level where the people actually live. In a cabin with any ceiling gap, loft opening, or door crack, that warm stratified air is the first thing to leak out when the door opens or the wind presses in. This is why frontier cabins cooled so quickly after the fire went out. The heat was never in the walls, the floor, or the structure. It was in the air, and air holds almost nothing. What Nora built operated on an entirely different principle. Dense stone, particularly quartzite and granite, has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.19 to 0.21 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. That means that for every pound of stone in her floor, and for every degree Fahrenheit you raise its temperature, it stores approximately 0.19 to 0.21 BTU of thermal energy. At first glance, that sounds modest. But multiply it across 9,000 pounds of stone and raise that mass by just 30 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of a 4-hour evening fire. And you're looking at somewhere between 51,000 and 57,000 BTU of stored thermal energy sitting in the floor, quietly, invisibly, waiting to be released. For reference, a cord of dry hardwood contains roughly 20 to 24 million BTU of potential energy. But a standard open hearth fire captures only a fraction of that, perhaps 10 to 15% in radiant and convective heat reaching the room. A well-managed fire in Nora's hearth, directed low and long across the floor surface rather than blazing tall up the flue, could charge her thermal mass with far more usable energy per pound of wood burned, because the goal was not to heat the air, it was to heat the stone. Stone, once heated, does not release its energy the way air does. Air responds instantly to temperature gradients. Stone responds slowly. The process of heat moving through dense rock, conduction, is governed by the rock's thermal conductivity, its mass, and the temperature difference between its surface and the surrounding air. In practical terms, a floor mass of the size and composition Nora assembled, charged to a surface temperature of roughly 90 degrees Fahrenheit to 100 degrees Fahrenheit by an evening fire, would release its stored heat at a rate slow enough to maintain a floor-level air temperature measurably above 60 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 to 12 hours after the fire was extinguished. The floor was not just a floor. It was a thermal battery. Charge it in the evening. Draw from it through the night. Wake to a room that had never fallen below the threshold of danger, without a single log added after 10 o'clock. This principle, thermal mass as a passive heat storage and release system, was ancient by the time Nora applied it. The Romans had used it in their hypocaust systems, circulating hot air beneath raised tile floors to warm their bath complexes. Korean ondol floors have been operating on a related principle for over 1,000 years, channeling flue gases beneath flat stone beds to heat sleeping rooms through the night. Indigenous peoples of the American Southwest had built adobe and stone structures whose thermal mass moderated interior temperatures across the brutal swings of high desert days and nights for centuries. None of those traditions were available to Nora Calloway as a textbook. She had not studied Roman engineering or Korean architecture, but she had watched river stones absorb heat from summer sun and hold it warm to the touch long after dark. She had pressed her palm against a stone hearth base 12 hours after a fire and found it still radiating. She had noticed, in ways that accumulated into understanding, what dense rock does with heat. And then she had taken that understanding and buried it 16 inches into the floor of her cabin, and waited for winter to prove her right. The storm arrived on the 8th of December. It came down from the north in the way the worst storms always did in that part of the Highlands. Quietly at first, a thickening of the sky that turned the ridge lines to gray smudges by mid-afternoon, then a dropping of the wind to nothing, that particular stillness that experienced people in the valley had learned to distrust. The temperature had been hovering near 22 degrees Fahrenheit since noon. By 4 o'clock, it was at 14 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. Nora had been expecting it for 2 days. The sky had told her, and the animals had told her. Her 2 horses pressed together in the lean-to shelter behind the cabin, breath steaming in thick clouds, not moving toward their hay, but standing still, heads low. Animals did not stand that way before a light frost. She fed the horses an extra measure of grain, secured the lean-to door with a doubled rope latch, and went inside. She built her fire at 4:30 in the afternoon. Not the roaring blaze a cold, frightened person builds, not the panicked, throat-wide fire that burns hot and fast and eats wood like paper. A deliberate fire, wide and low in the firebox, the logs positioned so the flame spread laterally across a broad base rather than leaping tall. She used split oak, dry and dense, the kind that burned slowly and put out a long, steady heat rather than a fast, showy flame. She had chosen her one cord with care. The design of her hearth supported what she was trying to do. She had built it lower and wider than the standard frontier fireplace. The firebox opening was roughly 28 inches wide and only 18 inches tall, dimensions that reduced the convective updraft and pushed more of the radiant heat forward and downward toward the floor rather than pulling it straight up the flue. It was not a technically elaborate modification, but it meant that a greater share of the fire's radiant output reached the stone surface within 12 to 15 feet of the hearth face, rather than vanishing up the chimney. She fed the fire steadily from 4:30 until 9:30 that evening. 5 hours. In those 5 hours, she burned approximately a quarter cord of split oak, more than she typically used in a week of moderate cold. But she was not heating the air. She was charging the floor. The stones nearest the hearth reached surface temperatures somewhere between 95 degrees Fahrenheit and 105 degrees Fahrenheit during the peak burn period, based on the plausible physics of the setup. The stones at the far wall of the room, 12 feet from the firebox, would have been cooler, perhaps 70 degrees Fahrenheit to 80 degrees Fahrenheit at surface. But the entire mass of the floor was above ambient. The whole thermal battery was loaded. At 9:30, she let the fire die down to coals. At 10 o'clock, she banked the coals under a thick layer of ash, a technique that preserved a slow combustion ember through the night without requiring active feeding, and she went to bed. Outside, by midnight, the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. By 2 in the morning, it was at -2 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest recorded in the South Branch Valley that winter, according to a note in the Methodist Church's weather ledger that has been cited in county historical accounts. Inside the cabin, the floor radiated. Not dramatically, not with any visible sign. Simply a slow, continuous release of stored thermal energy from 9,000 pounds of dense stone that had spent 5 hours absorbing everything the fire could give it. The floor-level air temperature in the cabin, measured in a rough reconstruction by the behavior of a small water dish Nora kept on the floor near the door to monitor overnight cold, never froze that night. It held. The dish was still liquid at 6 in the morning. When Nora rose at first light and pressed her palm to the floor beside the cold hearth, the stone was still warm to the touch. Not hot, not the aggressive warmth of a freshly charged surface, but undeniably, measurably warm. The residual warmth of mass that had been releasing stored BTUs for 8 hours and still had hours left to give. She rebuilt the fire with 2 small logs and a handful of kindling. Outside, the snow had come the night. It lay a foot deep across the bottomland, smooth and undisturbed, covering everything with the flat white silence that deep cold brings. The ridge lines above the valley were invisible in the gray morning. Up the hill, The first smoke from the German settlers' chimneys was already rising thick and urgent. The morning fires being rebuilt from cold ash after another night of interrupted sleep, another night of someone rising at 2 or 3 in the morning to feed wood to a hearth that had no memory, no residual warmth, no stored energy of any kind. Their cabins had woken up cold. Nora's had not. The difference, measured against the outside air temperature of -2 degrees Fahrenheit, was not a matter of comfort. That night, in that valley, with no road open and no neighbor close enough to reach quickly, it was a matter of survival. Elias Drummond was not a man who slept through the cold. He had learned not to, years earlier, during a winter that had taken 2 of his neighbor's cattle and cracked the mortar on the east wall of his own cabin so badly it had to be relaid in the spring. Since then, he had developed the habit, a habit shared by nearly every adult in that valley, of waking once or twice each night during hard cold spells to check the fire. Feed it 2 or 3 split logs. Wait until the room came back up to a temperature that felt survivable, then return to bed with the particular exhausted resignation of a man who knew he would be doing it again in 3 or 4 hours. The night of December 8th, he was up at midnight and again at 3 in the morning. His hearth was a good one, a proper stone firebox with a back wall angled to throw radiant heat forward into the room. He had built it himself, following the same general pattern every family in the valley used, the same general pattern that had been in use since the first settlers came through the Cumberland Gap 100 years earlier. Wide throat, tall flue, good draft. On a moderate winter night, it held the room acceptably. On a night like this one, -2 degrees Fahrenheit outside, a foot of fresh snow sealing the ground, wind pressing steadily down the hollow, the room dropped to somewhere near 38 degrees Fahrenheit to 42 degrees Fahrenheit within 4 hours of the fire burning down to coals. That was the number that mattered, not the dramatic cold outside, which the cabin walls blunted adequately, but that internal floor-level temperature, 38 degrees Fahrenheit to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, which was cold enough to make a sick child dangerous, cold enough to freeze a water pail left on the floor overnight, cold enough to make rising from bed at 3 in the morning feel like stepping into an open field. Across the valley that night, the pattern was uniform. Margaret and Silas Hensley, who farmed the 40 acres north of the Drummond property, were up at 1:30 and 4. Their youngest child, not yet 2 years old, had been running a fever for 3 days, and the cold made keeping him warm a constant and anxious labor. They burned through nearly a third of a cord that single night, according to a letter Margaret Hensley wrote to her sister in Harrisonburg the following week, a letter that has been preserved in a family collection and cited in county historical records. The Bauer family up the ridge, 4 adults and 6 children in a well-built, properly chink cabin with a large hearth and a solid stone foundation, were also up twice. August Bauer noted in his farm journal, in the clipped, practical entries he kept through every winter, that the household consumed 2 full armloads of split hickory between sundown and sunrise on December 8th. His handwriting, by the 3 in the morning entry, was noticeably less precise than his usual careful script. And Nora Calloway slept until first light. She had rebuilt her fire once, a brief, low burn in the pre-dawn hours, more out of habit than necessity, and had gone back to bed within 20 minutes. She burned, across that entire night and the following morning, roughly 1/8 of a cord, a fraction of what every other household in the valley had consumed to survive the same hours in the same cold. The difference was not the cabin walls. It was not the firewood quality. It was not the size of her hearth or the skill of her fire building, though she was competent at both. The difference was the 9,000 pounds of stone beneath her feet, steadily releasing the energy she had loaded into it the previous evening, invisible, silent, requiring nothing from her while she slept. By the time the valley began comparing notes in the days after the storm, the arithmetic was becoming impossible to ignore. Elias Drummond, who prided himself on keeping careful track of his wood supply, calculated that he had burned through approximately 40% of his 5-cord winter stack by the middle of January, well ahead of his expected consumption rate. The Hensley family, with the sick child and the constant nighttime fires, were looking at running short by February if the cold held. Nora, by the same point in January, had consumed less than half her single cord. The numbers told a story that no amount of skepticism could reframe. Under equivalent cold conditions, same valley, same storm, same duration of below-zero temperatures, her cabin was maintaining habitable warmth at a fraction of the fuel cost. Not slightly less, not a marginal improvement. Roughly 40 to 50% less wood burned across the worst weeks of the worst winter in recent memory. The floor that no one had understood was doing exactly what she had intended it to do. The question that the valley was slowly beginning to ask was not whether it worked. By January, that was settled. The question was how, and whether it was something that could be replicated. That question was about to arrive at her door in person. It was Elias Drummond who came first. Not because he was the most curious, and not because he was the most humble. He was, by all accounts, neither especially curious nor especially humble, but because he was the most practical man in the valley, and practical men, when the evidence becomes undeniable, tend to move toward it. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of January, carrying a smoked ham wrapped in cloth, a gift of the kind that in that community served the dual purpose of expressing goodwill and softening whatever awkward thing was about to be said. Nora accepted it without comment and invited him inside. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. The cabin was warm, not fiercely warm. There was no fire burning at that hour, only bank coals under a thick layer of ash, but perceptibly, almost stubbornly warm in the way a root cellar is cool, not because something was actively making it that temperature, but because the structure itself was holding it. The floor beneath his boots, when he stepped fully inside, had a faint but undeniable warmth to it that no wood plank floor ever had. It felt, he would tell his wife later, like standing on sun-warmed ground in September. He did not say he had been wrong. Men like Elias Drummond in 1872 did not use those words easily. What he said was that he had been thinking about her floor, and that he had some questions if she was willing. She was willing. The conversation lasted most of the morning, according to accounts that appear in a later generation family memoir that draws on what Elias told his children about that visit. Nora explained the stone selection, the density, the type, the reasoning behind choosing quartzite and granite over the more abundant limestone. She explained the layering, the depth, the clay packing between stones, the ashen clay surface coat. She walked him across the room and had him crouch and press his palm flat to the floor in different spots, near the hearth, at the center, at the far wall, so he could feel the temperature gradient himself. Warm near the firebox face, slightly cooler at the margins, but above ambient everywhere. Elias asked how long the heat lasted after the fire went out. She told him, between 8 and 12 hours in normal cold, longer in still weather, slightly less when the wind pressed hard against the north wall. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how much she had burned since the big storm in December. When she told him, he was quiet for longer. He left with the knowledge he had come for, and with the particular expression of a man recalculating something important. He did not apologize for the skepticism of the previous autumn. She did not ask him to, but something had shifted between them, the kind of shift that happens when a practical person is forced to update a firmly held assumption, and they do it without theater because the evidence gives them no other honorable option. Within 2 weeks, 3 other households had sent someone to ask similar questions. Margaret Hensley came herself on a gray Wednesday afternoon, with 2 of her children in tow. She spent less time on the technical questions and more time simply standing in the middle of the room, looking at the floor, looking at the cold hearth, looking at the temperature in a room that should not have been possible with no active fire. Her letter to her sister in Harrisonburg, written that same evening, described the visit in terms that were plainly odd. The floor was warm, the room held its heat, and the woman who had built it had done it alone with stones from the river and had been considered, not 3 months earlier, a harmless eccentric. The Bauer family sent their eldest son, a serious, methodical young man of about 20 named Heinrich, who arrived with a small notebook and a piece of charcoal and took what appeared to be measurements and sketched what he could observe of the floor surface. He did not speak much. He wrote things down. He thanked Nora formally and left. That next spring, The Bower cabin would have a new floor in the back room. By February, the laughter that had followed Nora Calloway through the previous autumn had gone completely quiet. No one had publicly admitted to laughing. No one had issued a correction or retraction. The valley had simply, gradually, without ceremony, stopped finding her floor amusing and started finding it instructive. The winter was not finished, though. It had one more hard push left in it. And that final cold snap, arriving in the first days of February with temperatures that dropped to -8 degrees Fahrenheit over 3 consecutive nights, would not just validate her method. It would establish it, beyond any remaining doubt, as the most effective heating system in the valley. To understand why Nora's choice of stone was so consequential, it helps to hold two pieces of river rock in your hands at the same time, one limestone, one quartzite, and feel the difference. It is not immediately obvious. Both are smooth, rounded by water, cold to the touch when you pull them from the riverbed. Both look like reasonable building materials. A settler in a hurry, and settlers in 1871 were almost always in a hurry, would have loaded whatever was close to hand and moved on. The difference between the two stones is not visible. It is physical. It lives inside the molecular structure of the rock itself, in the density of the crystal lattice, in the way the material responds when energy tries to move through it. Limestone, calcium carbonate, formed from compressed ancient sea life, has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.21 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit and a density of about 160 pounds per cubic foot. It is common, workable, and adequate for many construction purposes. But it has a thermal conductivity that is relatively high for a stone, meaning heat moves through it quickly in both directions. It charges fast under a fire and discharges fast when the fire dies. A limestone floor absorbs heat readily, but also gives it up readily, releasing its stored energy in a relatively short burst rather than a slow, sustained radiation. Quartzite, metamorphic rock, formed from sandstone subjected to intense heat and pressure over geologic time, is a different material in almost every way that matters for thermal mass. It is denser, harder, and has a lower thermal conductivity than limestone, meaning heat moves through it more slowly. It charges more slowly under a fire, but once loaded, it releases that energy over a significantly longer discharge curve. A floor built from quartzite and dense granite behaves thermally more like a large flywheel than like a simple radiator. It resists rapid change in either direction, absorbing and releasing at a pace determined by its own physical properties rather than by the immediate conditions around it. This is the behavior that Nora had observed empirically over years of watching stones in and around fires, at riverbeds in summer, at hearth bases in winter. She could not have named specific heat capacity. She could not have drawn a thermal conductivity curve. But she had developed, through sustained observation, an intuitive model of how different stones behaved, which ones stayed warm longest, which ones cracked under heat, which ones held their warmth deep rather than just at the surface. The river, it turned out, had done much of her material science for her. River-worn stones are pre-selected by physics. The process of transport, stones carried by current, tumbled against each other, rolled along riverbeds for sometimes hundreds of miles, removes the weak ones. Stones with internal fractures split under the stress of transport and become gravel or sediment. Stones with inclusion planes or mineral seams crack along those weaknesses and disperse. What survives the long journey down a river system to a valley floor is, almost by definition, the densest, most structurally coherent material in the geologic formation upstream. The south branch of the Potomac drained a watershed of hard metamorphic and igneous rock, quartzite ridges, granite intrusions, dense gneiss formations, and had been delivering the strongest specimens of those formations to Nora's door for millennia. She had, in effect, let the river run a quality control process that would have taken her weeks to replicate by hand. The specific combination she assembled, quartzite and granite in the lower two courses, with a finishing layer of smaller mixed stones packed in clay, created a thermal gradient within the floor's depth. The lower courses, being larger and denser, stored the majority of the energy and released it very slowly. The upper courses, being smaller and packed more tightly together with clay, conducted heat to the surface more readily, but also buffered the discharge rate with their own mass. The clay itself, river clay, slightly organic, with good adhesion and reasonable thermal mass of its own, acted as a continuous medium conducting heat across the entire surface rather than allowing hot and cold spots to develop around individual stones. The result was a floor that behaved with an unusual evenness, not blazing hot in one spot and cold in another, but consistently warm across its entire surface, declining slowly and uniformly through the night as the mass gave up its stored energy in a long, even exhale. When February's final cold snap arrived, 3 nights at -8 degrees Fahrenheit, Nora made one adjustment to her routine. She built her evening fire an hour earlier and ran it an hour longer, adding approximately 30% more charge to the floor mass before banking the coals. The additional charge was enough. Across all 3 nights, the cabin held. The floor-level temperature, based on the behavior of the water dish she kept as her rough gauge, stayed above freezing throughout. She used less than 1.5 cords of firewood across the entire winter. Her nearest neighbor, Elias Drummond, with a well-built and reasonably efficient cabin by the standards of the valley, used just over 4 cords. The Hensley family, with the young child and the constant nighttime fires, used closer to 5. Same valley, same storm, same cold. A difference of 3 cords of firewood, roughly 150 to 180 hours of hard wood-splitting labor, separated the winter that wore a family down from the winter that simply passed. The River Stones had known something. Nora had listened. The following autumn arrived with the particular clarity that comes after a hard year. The kind of clarity that settles over a community when the worst of something has passed and people are quietly taking stock of what they learned and what they intend to do differently. In the South Branch Valley, that reckoning was practical and deliberate. Nobody called a meeting. Nobody issued instructions. But across the bottomland and up the lower slopes of the ridges, in the weeks before the first frost of 1872, something was changing. Heinrich Bauer, the methodical young man who had arrived at Nora's door with a notebook the previous January, had spent the better part of the summer quietly at work in the back room of his family's cabin. His father, August, had given him the use of the space and a budget of labor and materials. By late September, Heinrich had excavated the floor to a depth of 12 inches, laid a bed of river sand, and assembled 2 courses of quartzite and granite collected from the same stretch of the South Branch that Nora had worked. His finishing layer used a clay and ash mixture that followed, as closely as he could reconstruct from memory and his notebook sketches, the same proportions Nora had used. He had made one modification of his own. Along the 2 walls adjacent to the hearth, he had built a low stone bench, roughly 8 inches high, 14 inches wide, continuous from the firebox surround to the far corner, using the same dense river stones. The bench extended the thermal mass vertically, adding surface area that would radiate warmth at seated height rather than only at floor level. It was, in retrospect, a genuinely intelligent adaptation. The floor charged overnight. The bench provided warmth where bodies actually rested during the evening hours before bed. August Bauer noted in his farm journal, in November of 1872, that the back room was noticeably warmer than the front room by 6 in the morning. He did not editorialize. He simply recorded the fact with the temperature differential he had measured using a glass thermometer borrowed from the county physician, 8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in the stone-floored room than in the wood-floored front room, at 6 a.m., with no fire having burned since 10 the previous night. 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Measured. Recorded. Undeniable. Elias Drummond did not rebuild his floor that autumn. His wife had concerns about the disruption to the household, and Elias was not a man who moved fast on domestic changes. But he made a different modification, drawn from the same principle. He built a new section of wall along the interior face of his north-facing exterior wall, a second skin of dense stone, roughly 8 inches thick, mortared into place against the existing log wall, filling a panel roughly 6 feet wide and 5 feet tall beside the hearth. A heat wall, not a floor, but a vertical thermal mass that caught radiant heat from the firebox, stored it through the peak burn hours, and released it slowly through the night. It was cruder than Nora's floor and less effective per pound of stone. A wall mass radiates only from its exposed face, while a floor mass radiates upward into the living space from the entire surface. But it worked. Elias burned approximately a cord and a half less wood that winter than the winter before, and he slept through more nights without rising to tend the fire. 2 other families on the bottomland built stone floors that autumn, following Nora's method as accurately as they could from conversations with her and with Heinrich Bauer. One of them, the Whitfield family, who had arrived in the valley only the previous spring and had no pre-existing opinion about river stones or eccentric homesteaders, simply asked Nora directly if she would walk them through the process. She spent 2 days at their property in October, showing them the stone selection, the excavation depth, the layering sequence, the clay packing. She brought a small sample of the quartzite from her own floor for comparison when they were at the riverbank, so they could hold it against other stones and feel the weight difference. By the time the winter of 1872 to 73 arrived, 4 cabins in the South Branch Valley had stone thermal mass floors. 3 more had modified their hearth surrounds or interior walls with dense stone additions drawn from the same principle. The valley had not formally adopted a new technology. It had done something more durable. It had watched something work, tested it, adapted it to individual circumstances, and passed it along. That is how vernacular engineering survives. Not through publication or patent or formal instruction. Through one person showing another person, in October, how to tell quartzite from limestone by the weight in your hand and the ring when you knock 2 pieces together. The winter of 1872 to 73 was milder than the one before it. The valley was, in some ways, better prepared regardless. But the households that had carried the lesson forward from the previous year burned less wood, slept longer, and spent fewer mornings rebuilding fires from cold ash. Nora Calloway spent that second winter as she had spent the first, warm, efficient, largely untroubled by the cold that pressed against the outside of her walls. She had not changed her method. She had not needed to. The first winter had already shown her that what she had built was right. She simply lived in it and let the floor do its work. Walk into almost any house built in the United States in the last 70 years and stand still for a moment. Feel the floor beneath your feet. If it is a wood frame house, and the overwhelming majority of American residential construction is wood frame, you are standing on a layer of finished flooring, typically 3/4 of an inch of hardwood or engineered composite, over a plywood subfloor of similar thickness, over floor joists with insulation bats between them, over a crawl space or uninsulated basement. The total thermal mass of that floor assembly, from finished surface to the air below, negligible. A wooden plywood floor has a specific heat capacity roughly 1/10 that of dense stone. It stores almost no thermal energy. When the heat source goes off, it goes cold within minutes. If it is a slab-on-grade house, concrete poured directly on a prepared ground base, common in the Sun Belt and in post-war suburban construction, you are standing on a material with genuine thermal mass. Concrete has a specific heat capacity roughly comparable to limestone, around 0.22 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, and a density of approximately 140 to 150 pounds per cubic foot. A standard 4-inch residential slab is not nothing. It stores energy. In theory, it could behave as a passive thermal buffer, absorbing daytime heat and releasing it at night in climates where that is useful. In practice, it almost never does, because the modern residential slab is almost universally insulated from below, separated from the ground by a vapor barrier and a layer of rigid foam, and heated from above by forced air systems that push warm air at ceiling level rather than warming the floor mass directly. The slab never gets warm enough to function as a thermal battery because the heating system is not designed to charge it. It is designed to heat the air, which is the same fundamental error that Nora Calloway's neighbors made in 1871 with their open-throat fireplaces. The principle Nora applied has not disappeared from modern construction. It exists in radiant floor heating systems, hydronic loops embedded in concrete or gypcrete, circulating heated water at low temperatures to warm the slab from within. These systems are recognized by building engineers as among the most efficient heating methods available. They deliver warmth at floor level where it is most useful. They charge a thermal mass that releases heat slowly and evenly, and they operate at water temperatures low enough to integrate efficiently with heat pumps and solar thermal collectors. A well-designed radiant floor system in a well-insulated house can maintain comfortable interior temperatures with operating costs 25 to 40% lower than a conventional forced air system, according to estimates cited in building performance literature. But radiant floor systems are installed in a small fraction of new residential construction in the United States. They cost more upfront. They require planning at the foundation stage, which means they cannot be retrofitted easily into existing homes. The building industry's default, with framing, forced air, thin floors with no thermal mass, is cheaper to build initially, straightforward to install, and produces houses that heat up quickly from cold but cannot hold warmth for more than a few hours without active energy input. This is the trade Nora's neighbors made in reverse. They paid more in operating cost, wood, labor, interrupted sleep, for a lower initial investment. A stone floor costs more to build than a plank floor. A radiant slab costs more to install than a forced air duct system. In both cases, the upfront premium buys decades of reduced operating cost. In both cases, the market has repeatedly chosen the cheaper upfront option and paid the difference in fuel and discomfort for the life of the structure. The technology changes. The trade-off does not. There is one additional dimension that the modern construction industry has largely abandoned and that Nora's floor embodied completely: connection to the ground. Her thermal mass was not isolated from the earth beneath it. It was in direct contact with it, separated only by a thin sand bed. The stable ground temperature at depth, that 48 degrees Fahrenheit to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, that never varied significantly through the seasons, served as a thermal anchor, slowing the rate at which the floor mass lost its stored heat downward. The floor did not radiate only upward into the room. It also conducted slowly downward into the earth, and the earth, being large and thermally stable, accepted that energy at a rate so slow it was functionally negligible on the scale of a single winter night. Modern construction separates floors from the ground with insulation specifically to prevent this conduction. The argument being that cold ground will draw heat out of the slab. In a house with a thin, uncharged slab and a forced air system running intermittently, that argument has merit. In a house with a deep, properly charged thermal mass floor, the same ground temperature that would chill an uncharged slab becomes a thermal stabilizer, a buffer against rapid heat loss, a passive partner in the overnight temperature management of the space. The difference is whether you design the floor to store heat or simply to cover the ground. Nora Calloway designed it to store heat. The houses most of us live in today simply cover the ground. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not travel well through institutions. It does not fit neatly into textbooks because it is too specific to place, to the particular density of the quartz site in one riverbed, to the particular depth of the frost line in one valley, to the particular angle at which one woman's low firebox cast its radiant output across one clanstone floor. It does not survive easily in professional education because it requires the kind of accumulated observation that only comes from living in a place through enough winters to understand what the cold actually does, not just what the calculations predict it will do. What Nora Calloway understood, and what the families of the South Branch Valley came to understand after her, was not a formula. It was a relationship between the materials available in that specific landscape, the thermal behavior of those materials under the conditions of that specific climate, and the particular geometry of a small heated space trying to stay warm through a long, dark night. She had learned it the way most durable technical knowledge is learned before the age of formal engineering, by watching, by pressing her palm against a stone hearth base 12 hours after a fire, by noticing which stones at the riverbank stayed warm longest after a July afternoon, by standing in her unfinished cabin in the October cold and understanding, with the directness that comes from having no other option, that she needed the floor itself to become part of the heating system, not a passive surface above the heating system, but an active component of it. The principle she applied is older than any European settlement of the American frontier. It is older than the Roman hypocaust, though the Romans systematized it magnificently. It appears in the archaeological record of Stone Age structures across northern Europe and Asia. Hearthstones arranged not for cooking alone, but for the overnight warmth they would continue to radiate after the fire's peak. It is present in the thick adobe walls of Pueblo architecture in the American Southwest, which moderated interior temperatures not through insulation, but through the slow thermal inertia of dense earth mass. It underlies the Korean ondal, the Scandinavian stenseng, the Russian pesh. Every culture that spent significant time in serious cold eventually arrived, through empirical pressure, at some version of the same insight. Air does not hold heat. Mass does. What the modern built environment largely lost in the century of cheap energy that followed the Second World War was the imperative to build for thermal mass. When fuel is expensive and labor is cheap, as it was for every frontier settler who spent weeks splitting firewood by hand, the incentive to build a floor that reduces fuel consumption by 40 to 50% is immediate and compelling. When fuel is cheap and labor is expensive, as it became across most of the industrialized world through most of the 20th century, the same floor is an extravagance, a time-consuming construction detail that can be replaced by simply burning more oil or gas. That calculation is shifting again. Energy costs are rising. Interest in passive heating and cooling strategies, thermal mass, earth sheltering, radiant systems, south-facing glass, has grown steadily among home builders, off-grid designers, and anyone who has spent time thinking seriously about the long-term operating costs of structure. The principles are being rediscovered, formalized, and reapplied in contexts that range from high-performance passive houses in Scandinavia to off-grid homesteads in the American Mountain West. None of this would have surprised Nora Calloway. She did not need a rediscovery movement or an energy crisis to tell her that a floor made of river stone would hold heat longer than a floor made of pine boards. She needed one winter in the South Branch Valley Hollow, where the cold came down the ridges at night and sat in the low ground like standing water, and the particular quality of attention that allowed her to understand what she was observing and to act on it. The fire she built on the evening of December 8th, 1871, went out before midnight. The floor it charged went on heating her cabin until well past 6 in the morning. That is not a miracle. It is not folklore. It is physics, the slow, patient, invisible physics of dense stone releasing stored energy at a rate determined entirely by its own nature, indifferent to the cold outside, indifferent to the darkness, indifferent to the doubt of everyone who had watched her drag those stones from the river and seen only an eccentric woman with a wagon full of rocks. The heat did not come from the fire. The heat came from what she decided to put between the fire and the cold floor, between the flame and the frozen ground, between the short window of burning with each evening and the long, unattended hours of the night. It came from the stones, and the stones, in the end, knew exactly what to do. Educational and historical content only, not a substitute for professional engineering or construction guidance.